Welcome to the Environmental Due Diligence podcast by Lightbox, the podcast dedicated to environmental professionals. At Lightbox, we are at the forefront of delivering solutions for commercial real estate intelligence. Today, our host, Alan Agadoni, SVP Environmental Due Diligence Solutions at Lightbox, talks to Matt Lesh, professional geologist at SLR International Corporation, who is also the task group chair for the ASTM standard for ESAs on Forestland or rural properties E224723. Recently, the task group completed an update of the standard, and EPA recognized E224723 as meeting the requirement of the all-appropriate inquiry rule for defense from CERCLA liability.
And welcome to our podcast where experienced environmental professionals talk about conducting due diligence on commercial real estate. And today I'm happy to speak with Matt Lesh about another important standard practice update, one which is really there's not that much information available publicly. And I guess you could argue it's not really commercial real estate, but it is something that environmental professionals do encounter in their practice, whether they specialize in it like Matt or not. So welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for having me today.
Let's talk a little bit about who you are and how you found yourself running a task group on Forestland or rural property ESAs.
Sure. So I grew up in the Pacific Northwest and always have loved the outdoors. Spent a lot of time in the trees growing up, backpacking and camping. Went to school, became a geologist. The outdoor part of that was appealing to me too, along with the desktop science as well. But the first 10 years of my career, more in like redevelopment and remediation, always with, due diligence in the background. Joined SLR about 10 years ago and still in the Pacific Northwest, and got involved with a smaller group of Timberland assessment where we had a smaller practice back then. And that just sounded appealing to me to get a break from the office, go out in the woods when I could, and just a little bit different type of work than I'd been used to. That morphed into me joining ASTM. My mentor at the time, Gene Watson, was pretty heavily involved with that and encouraged me to join. And then when he retired, I took over the task group chair role from him and wrapped up the update that Alan just referenced. So yeah, that's kind of my background, and it's been interesting, and every project a little bit different. So I've enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, and so you would consider yourself a specialist in this area versus, someone who occasionally does this kind of work?
I'd say the last 5 years, at least 60% of my work is related to consulting on large timberland and sometimes agricultural land transactions. Other parts of my practice are more industrial site, commercial real estate, more like environmental health and safety assessment. So it's been a good mix.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about the process, just to set the stage for people who haven't been keeping track of this particular standard update, because there's been a lot of things going on lately. On our last podcast, we spoke with Jim Bartlett quite a bit about the big picture of ASTM and all the things that go into a practice development and a revision and an update. So we don't need to go too deep here, but when did things start with Gene? I guess he was the one who started this. What were the goals? What was generally the idea here behind updating this standard, which was 2016?
Yeah. And you definitely spoke to the right person. Jim Bartlett is the guru when it comes to all of the nuts and bolts of how these things get actually done with ASTM. Yeah, the last version of this was in 2016, and Gene really led that revision. And then we were approached about 2019 to really update this standard to be consistent with a lot of the updates that were being made with 1527 at the same time, even though those two standards are on kind of a 2-year different cycle. We just had 21 published a couple of years ago, and now we're at 23. So we were trying to tie them together a little bit closer date-wise. But once we dug into 2247 a bit more, we realized, well, there's a lot of stuff that's actually not applicable that we would normally review for a commercial property with 1527 that we needed to, reevaluate how can we incorporate that or not into 2247. So that resulted in maybe a few more meetings and discussions with our task group, which made the process take a little longer than we initially thought. But in the end, I think we got a better product and more buy-in from our group, and I'm hoping buy-in from the community at large. So, started in 2019, thought it would take about 2 years, took 4, but there's still a ton of overlap between 1527 and 2247, we look at them as sort of sister standards, even though there are some key differences.
I think you hit the nail on the head. There were so many changes to E1527 in 21 that if all
Right.
you did was make the commensurate changes to 2247, it would have taken you a couple of years just to do that, probably, because they're
Yeah.
not duplicates of each other, but they are related. So I think that's one of the interesting things about this practice is that people may not think of it too much because it's so closely related to E1527, but it does have its own flavor. And like I said, we'll talk about that in a second. But one thing I did want to say before we moved on to getting the nuts and bolts of it is I wanted to mention that you were awarded a Distinguished Service Award from the E50.02 committee. So I want to say congratulations on that. And
No, thank
is there
you.
anybody else you want to give kudos to in getting this thing done? Because that usually it's a team effort.
Well, sure. And actually, Gene was issued the same award. And other folks who were really kind of key members of our test group for this one were Jerry Massengill and Georgina Dannett, who are pretty heavily involved in 1527 as well. They really helped with the historical section of the standard, which was quite the change from before. And then, of course, Jim Bartlett helping me figure out the steps of after we're done with it, what's next, who has to review it, and going to publishing and all that. I will say a lot of or nearly everybody on our test group with 2247 is also heavily involved in 1527. We know each other well. So that really helped moving along.
Right. Because at least you had the consensus of 1527 to work from instead of
Right.
starting from a lot of divergent opinions. So that's good for you. So let's talk about that now. Let's go into the standard a little bit and make sure we hit on some of the key areas. By my research, the standard was published in December 2023. And just a few weeks ago in June, I think it was June 24th, EPA announced that the 2016 version of the standard that we were just talking about will no longer meet all appropriate inquiry. And I guess for that sense, the CERCLA defenses associated with it as of August 23, 2024. That's pretty big right there. Am I on track so far with the timing?
Let me clarify one thing, Alan, on
Okay.
that. So as of August 23, 2024, 2247-23 will be recognized formally by EPA as compliant with AAI. In their announcement, and they did this similar with 1527, they're going to allow EPs to use the 16 standard for another year, but no one really is going to do that because it will be considered outdated in the marketplace.
Right.
Legally, they could, but once people realize, hey, 2247-23 is now the current standard of practice, that's what's going to be requested by lenders and attorneys and all the people, developers and whoever else request these things. So it will sunset a year from August, but generally it will be phased out pretty
Right.
quickly. So people can still use it and it would be AAI compliant, but we found with 1527, that wasn't the case with the older standard.
Yeah. And now that you've had 1527 live in the field for a couple of years,
Yeah.
the grandfathering concept there has expired. So now
Right.
basically the argument for the older version of any standard for due diligence at this point is probably pretty tough.
I totally agree.
Yeah. So you've mentioned that there are some similarities and there's some differences. If you go to the first opening section of 2247, it says, this sounds very similar to the opener of 1527, but it does mention that this is for, a exceptional kind of property, right? So
Right. That's correct.
there are things which stand out and seem different and be more practical if they were done a different way. So let's just talk about that for a bit. Like, let's talk about some of the basic structure and requirements. We know that it's related to 1527. And then what are some of the differences between where you spent probably most of your time expanding on 1527?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll talk about some key similarities first.
Okay, let's
and
do
then I'll
that.
go into the differences. The objective of both standards is the same. We're trying to identify recognized environmental condition or not on a property related to hazardous substances and petroleum products. So that doesn't change. How we get there is a little bit different, but the main sources of info or the key components of a phase 1 ESA are the same across both standards, meaning regulatory review records, historical review, interviews, and the site reconnaissance. as well as the EP declaration. But those are the key components. They're both valid. 6 months. All of that is the same.
And in
Um,
general, the language and the wording and the philosophy and the principles are all the same too, right? I mean,
that's
that's what
correct.
you spend time doing. Okay.
That's correct.
Good.
Some key differences are for historical, for example, if you have a large, 50,000 acre property of timberlands, you're not going to have a bunch of addresses associated with that. So city directories are likely not going to be helpful
No.
or really
Available.
critical or available
Yeah.
or however you want to, couch it for your research component. More useful information, certainly interviews, people that are familiar with the property. Historical aerial photos, absolutely. Topographic maps. And I wanted to correct one misconception that I think people have about 2247. Earlier versions of this, I think it was even pre 2016, did have kind of an acreage limitation in the introduction. So it was designed initially for properties 120 acres or larger. That was taken out a couple cycles ago because it really is more about not the size of the property, but the use. So we would typically say that if it's a well-developed commercial property, 1527 would be the way to go. If generally these agricultural and timberland properties are larger, but there's limited structures on it, there's limited industrial activities on it. So 2247 would probably be the more appropriate way to. So wanted to kind of get that out there because I think some people say, oh, my property's not big enough to use this
Right.
standard. That's no longer it.
I'm glad you cleared that up because that does seem, as you read it, that does seem to be one of the key things here. It's about changing people's ideas about how to approach a certain type of property that has physical and operational characteristics that just
Right.
don't work well with 1527 practices. Yeah.
So
So,
another, key difference is how we decide what parts of a agricultural or timberland property we are going to visit because you can't say, let's say my 50,000 acre example that we saw every square inch of it. That's not realistic, nor is it really warranted. So the desktop component of a 2247 assessment is very key. So taking those sources that I was talking about and coming up with what we call areas of environmental interest and making that almost like a GIS or a lot of times Google Earth areas that we want to go. One, ask more questions of people that are familiar with the property and, or do we need to go ground truth to see, is there actual chemical storage here? Or is it just, a hunting camp, for example, that's very common on these properties, or is it an old silo and we're not sure if it's a tank or not. So, with a 1527 phase one, you're kind of applying a pretty detailed inspection of the entire property as well as adjacent property. With 2247, you're really doing the legwork ahead of time. So your field time is the most efficient and you're not spending time traversing over forest roads where all you're seeing is trees. How I like to describe this is we're really looking for non-timber operation, old landfill, old field offices that may have had underground storage tank, old mine site, oil and gas operation. So timber itself, there's really not an environmental risk there.
would you say though that there are operations associated with timber management practices that you do want to identify and look for? In other words, you're not saying is forestry in general, forestry services, whether they're harvesting, planting, or managing, are there hazardous substances, environmental conditions associated just with those practices?
Sure.
Okay.
We always ask questions about pesticides and herbicides, for example. How are those applied to the property? Are they stored on the property? And in general, they're not. Timberland owners are, savvy enough to know that it's not a great idea to store this stuff long term on the property. So they typically would use, a third party vendor that comes in. There's accepted chemicals used and chemical rates used as far as best management practices with timber harvesting. Those are run by big forest agencies. It's a little bit different than your standard, DHU or something. So yeah, the governing bodies for this kind of work, they are different than, let's say, an industrial site.
When does a rural property fit the 2247?
Yeah, that's a little
scope?
trickier. We think of like ranch land.
Yeah.
So where the bulk of the property is fairly undeveloped, maybe some pastures, maybe some corral, likely, a farm headquarters, if you want to call it that, or a range headquarters where they may have, a farmhouse, some support structures. So they may be doing, equipment maintenance on tractors out there and stuff. So that would be a key area of interest for a large ranch property. But, if the ranch is mostly, let's say 90% undeveloped, then a 1527 phase one probably wouldn't be the way to go. You would want to, focus in on current and historical structures on the property. So outside of an urban area, you're probably not going to have a lot of, you know, neighboring sites of concern. You're not in an urban area and not in a dense area by any stretch. So
How about in so-called corporate or industrial agricultural operations? Are those something that you think 2247 applies well to, or would you be? Is it a judgment call on those?
again, I think it matters on the development status of the property. So
Hmm.
again, if it's mostly, fields and managed fields, yeah, we use 2247 on that as well. So
Okay.
we would, on those sites, the focus would be on, okay, irrigation structures or again, support facilities for that. And there's been a lot more of that with folks interested in farmland to then convert it to more of a renewable resource. So that's a driver for assessing those properties.
And
So,
historically, these uses change over time. So it could be yesterday's ranch land was today's
absolutely. And
something else. Yeah.
that's a great point, Alan, because we will look at historical area photos and you'll see like, well, oh gosh, okay, now the headquarters was over here historic.
Yeah.
So we'll, when we go out there, that'll be an area of interest that we'll go look to see, okay, what's left over here. And sometimes we'll find, old wells that were never abandoned. Sometimes we'll find an old sawmill for crying out loud, that's rarer, but it does happen.
And
So,
sometimes on the fringes of these properties, you'll find dumps and uncontrolled waste pits and things like that, because that was a common practice back in the day. So I remember some farmers, for some work that I did in Middle Georgia, were leasing or renting their properties out sometimes for people to dump on when they didn't have a crop, they didn't have a good, useful purpose for that particular tract. It just turned into
absolutely.
a dump, then cover it back up and do something else with it. Yeah.
No, it's so true. And even more recently, with PFAS being
Mm.
a topic of du jour, now questions come up on biosolids. So if there's biosolid, coming from an industrial wastewater treatment plant being applied to farmland, well, that can become an issue.
All the attention that 1527 paid to these emerging contaminants, that's also right smack into 2247 as well.
Right. Maybe a different methodology because let's say you're using 1527 on a more industrial site. You think we're worried about their specific processed wastewater practice. There's not a lot of processed
Yeah.
wastewater being generated on a rural farm or a timberland property. So it's really what's the mechanism of how it may have gotten onto the property and or stored there.
Since we're doing a PFAS webinar series and some other things, they're asking about fire control in general and whether any concerns about PFAS use associated with, you know, these gigantic fires we read about and see and experience it all the time.
A lot of the knowledge is anecdotal. So you ask, there can be large fires on these properties. Well, in general, is water used to put out with it, or is there some other retardant used to put out with it? So it's hard to completely rule out, but we have to kind of rely on what the forest managers know because they're involved with the day to day on
Yeah.
managing the forest. They'll know more about it than we ever will. So
So other
there,
than a case by case incident or something where
yeah,
someone just had to do what they had to do and use something that wasn't maybe ideal even for purposes of fighting big forest fires, but in general, it would seem that there's a lot less more cost effective ways to fight forest
I think
fires
so.
using,
Yeah,
industrial chemicals. So yeah, it would seem
right.
like it wouldn't be that common unless again, you had a instance where perhaps a car fire or a plane crash resulted in a forest fire, then you might have a plume out there too. Who knows?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. So
Okay. Well, so we talked about the similarities. I know you hit on some of the differences. Is there any other differences you want to talk about or highlight today?
no, I think the main thing was really just the site reconnaissance. That's the main difference.
Yeah, I
And
did.
that
I did
that's
feel
the
like
main
you did a
thing.
great job of providing discussion and amplification of the areas where you felt like we need to amplify on how to do this or how to apply this particular direction. It seemed like there was some good discussion in the standard that you included in there for people to kind of take and run with.
Yeah, I mean, every property is unique, but I yeah, trying to highlight the sources that are most useful. The use of the property is key, and then just kind of narrowing it down from there.
I think most people don't think about a lot about historical research when they think about large properties. They think it's crazy. How can you possibly do that? Like you said earlier, there's limited amounts of information available, but it needs to be looked at, right? Because isn't that what
Oh, absolutely.
drives this? What drives this practice is what's happened in the past and historical uses more than what you can just see today.
Aerial photos are our best friend when it comes to that. On occasion, we'll get some long-term managers of the property that have really good knowledge that have been familiar with the property for 40 plus years, but that's pretty rare. Those people retire and move on,
Yeah.
and a lot of that knowledge gets lost. So if there's anything that we're not sure about or when you're doing that standard, then it's worth flagging as an area of interest. And if you can't rule it out through an interview or some other source, then yeah, the idea would be to go visit that yourself and actually document it and figure out what it actually is or was to the best of your ability.
So let's say you haven't used this scope of work a lot, or you're thinking about using it, and you're now moving on to the stage where your client has agreed that that's probably the appropriate scope to use. What kind of clients are usually driving this kind of work? What is the client base? And is there anything particular about that client base that they look for when looking for an EP to do this kind of work?
Sure. Timberland investors would be one category, and they generally upholding, across the US. So they might look at, okay, what's the geographical footprint of the firm we're looking to use? That's a pretty small world, I would
Mhm.
say. There's firms that kind of specialize in it. There's also, private landowners that are looking just to sell their family farm.
Yeah.
And there's also, outside investors that are also looking at investing in renewable. That seems to be a very more recent development the last five years or so.
How about the infrastructure types? Like, do you use this standard when someone's coming to you and saying, I've got a big road or a railroad line or something that's going through a large portion of
Good
rural
question. Hard to
pasture.
think how we've done those before. I don't think I've used the standard for that. It would depend on kind of the alignment of the road and what it's going through.
Okay.
Because a lot of time it can be a combination of fairly urban areas and then it goes out to more, remote areas. So yeah, that'd be interesting, Alan, because that's more like a corridor study.
Yeah.
So I think in the past I've more used 1527, but it was really completely a new development and they just wanted a roadway through it and have an idea of what it was. You certainly could use
You could do it. Yeah.
um
Or you could do a
but
hybrid. There's
for
that's
yeah,
the thing is you can take what you need and make sure you document it very, very, very well if you deviate from the standard.
yeah. One last thing on just kind of what for scoping. If you're going to use this standard and your client is not familiar with it, the report format for this is generally quite a bit different than a typical
Hmm.
1527. So I've been talking about areas of environmental interest. Those are often put in like a table format with latitude and longitude. So there's no physical address associated. So the text of your report would be typically far less. What you're really focusing on is the data that you're providing for those areas of interest, like all the sources tabulated like that. Usually in an appendix, and then figures are important too to highlight where you actually identify these on the larger property. So that might be a good discussion to have because they may have a misconception on what you're actually delivering. So it'd be good to have that discussion up front. Um,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
not a
Because
team
that's not something
or
you see in a phase one ESC too much. Most of
no,
the organizing principles are generally addresses and tracts
sure,
of land and properties, not areas. But
right,
the concept of areas is something that environmental professionals are pretty comfortable and familiar with because
sure.
that concept exists in many other types of practices and pursuits when you're looking at doing environmental assessments and things like that. So, yeah, it seems to work. I had a couple of questions that we hadn't hit on yet. One was, what about the beyond scope? One of the big changes in 1527 was the addition of emerging contaminants and kind of the rewriting and updating of the beyond scope stuff. When you do this kind of work, do you see much of a need for that? Or like, are there specific add-on services that seem to come up sometimes, or that the EP could propose if they have those skills?
The most common one I see is like threatened and endangered species.
Hmm.
And a lot of that can be done desktop wise. And that really would identify these are the likely or potential species that would be on this property. It doesn't include a site visit where you'd really want a biologist on your team to actually go out there and assess possible habitat. But if a client is looking at a property, they may want to be aware of what they may run into when they're developing their farm management plan or harvest plan. So that's fairly common. I'd say more recently, biodiversity has been kind of a topic that's come up that may result in, credits or similar to carbon credits eventually. The market kind of hasn't worked itself out, but that could be an add-on but again, you would need more like a field biologist to actually go out there and do a baseline. It's pretty intensive, but I see that coming up in the next few years, honestly. And then, yeah, I mentioned well abandonment. So there can be follow-on work
Hmm.
or a dump cleanup, as you mentioned, Alan, like that does get found on there. But
When it comes to doing your site reconnaissance, what's your feeling and experience about using drones, flyovers, things like that? Is that practical? Is it something that can be done during due diligence? What's your thoughts on that?
internally, we've discussed it. And to justify the cost, and there are some limitations with it as far as the line of sight. It would need to be a site that we really do need eyeballs on, but isn't either safe to visit or really accessible because there could be an older site where like, gosh, I can't rule out if there were storage sinks here or not. And now it's no longer accessible, either even by hiking or the road
Mhm.
is no longer viable. I could see a situation like that. I haven't run across it, but I've been trying to think of where I would actually use it. But I don't see, at least for the scale of properties I'm used to, being able to do a completely remote drone assessment because it's too spread out.
Let's talk a little bit about safety too, because I know that, the standard practice can't conceive of and teach people about all the variables there. And they don't even, it doesn't even try. It just says, we can't possibly cover all the safety issues here, but there clearly are some. Is there a few things that you want to say about that? I think if you practice in this field long enough, someone's going to chase you away from a property, or you might, might encounter something that you don't want to out there in the wild, and that's, it's real. It's a real concern. So, what say you on that?
Well, similar to 1527, this is a technical standard, and ASTM really isn't in the business of trying to prescribe safe methods. I think part of it is honestly liability.
Yeah.
And so they do pretty specifically kind of put it back onto the user and most consultants have, or EPs have, their internal safety programs and benchmark to do work safely for their staff. For this, a lot of times it's the best practice to be accompanied by someone that's familiar with the property rather than working on these properties remotely
Yeah.
or on your own. There are times where that's difficult with people's schedules. So when we have to send someone out remotely, we send someone with a spot GPS locator. That's important. Um, Trying to have the right vehicle and being told it's okay to turn around. There's really nowhere we have to get to out here, even if ideally would want to, but sometimes it's just not possible. Weather systems come in, roads aren't what we thought they were. So certainly we've had people get stuck, but we haven't lost anybody out there.
Sure.
But there are, a lot of these parts of the country are rural. So there are people that have, property disputes. They're not really sure where their property line is. They're storing stuff on someone else's property and it's gotten ugly over the years. So we try and ask, is there anything like that we should steer clear of? Another concern, is there active harvesting going on the property while we're going to be there? Is it also hunting? So
Yeah.
sending people with the right PPE is really important.
Super important. Yeah, I think we had to mention that. And I'm glad we did because that was something that if you don't think about it, it'll be a problem. I think we've covered a lot of the territory, but were there any other takeaways that we didn't hit on yet? Or do you think we've pretty much got it done?
No, I think I would just, in summary, I would just say that depending on the use of the property, and if it is rural or forest land, consider using this because it can be a much more efficient and clear way to convey what's important on a property like this from an environmental standpoint. I think if using the wrong standard, it makes it more a little more clunky and difficult to describe what really matters. And a lot of times, a lot of the property just isn't all that interesting. There are specific areas on a property that really could pose a risk. And that's really what we're trying to do as EPs is advise our client on what else comes along with this property besides the farmland.
I don't think I could say it any better than that. So I'm just going to say thank you, Matt. And, thanks to everybody who's listening out there. Please let us know if you have any feedback, questions, suggestions for future topics for this podcast. Please contact me or your Lightbox EDR representative. And cheers, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Environmental Due Diligence podcast by Lightbox. Tune in next month for timely coverage of news and issues impacting commercial real estate property due diligence. This podcast was produced by the team at Lightbox, your trusted source for commercial real estate intelligence. Access this episode and all our future episodes at lightboxre.com/podcast or your favorite podcast streaming platform. Until next time.